Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dennis, and in this session, we're going to discuss some of the main challenges in matrix organizations when it comes to especially collecting and acting on employee feedback. So, before we get into it, I wanted to share a high-level agenda for the session where we'll cover three of the most common challenges we hear about. And my goal today is not to tease you with the problems and leave you hanging. So we will actually also discuss some concrete solutions to address these challenges. But I'll try to make sure I pace myself so that we have some time for your questions and then wrap it up with some key takeaways. And just as a side note, feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A section, which is under the chat. It'll make it a lot more easier for me to overview any questions you may have and answer them promptly. But before we start, who am I? Well, as you saw, my name is Dennis, and some of you have most likely met me before because I've been at Eletive for the past 6 years now. And I currently specialize in enterprise sales, which means that I meet with our largest global customers to discuss their feedback challenges and their people vision, basically where they are right now versus where they want to be in a few years, to better understand if Eletive could be a good fit. But throughout my tenure here, I've met with over 600 companies, and what I can tell you already is that no matrix organization is the same. So this makes today's topic quite complex, which is also what made me excited to share our insights on this in the first place. But with that said, um, the problems I'm going to share are generalized challenges and concepts we have seen. And my aim for today is to give you some inspiration and maybe food for thought on what the potential solutions could look like. So if we take a look at the main challenges we hear about, the first one is connected to data and organization structure. So you simply have a lot of companies that accurately store their functional organization structure in their HRIS, but their non-functional reporting line is not really kept up to date. So this is what creates a major challenge to create a reporting structure that accurately represents the business. The second challenge is what you can call a lack of ownership over the engagement results. Because when multiple managers receive the results, it's quite common that no one actually takes lead, which in itself is really problematic since it can spiral and cause other problems such as survey reluctance among employees. And the third challenge comes from an employee's point of view of not knowing which manager I'm actually giving feedback to. And this is a sense it can be quite ambiguous in the survey itself, depending on how you structure it. And this is a situation you also want to avoid since you want to ensure a high data quality, of course, and have accurate feedback to work with. So how can we then address these challenges? Well, if we break down the first challenge of having insufficient HRS data to create a matrix structure, we can see that this challenge can be broken down into two individual problems. The first one being, as we discussed, that the data is simply not reported in the HRS. And in large organizations, this causes a tedious admin problem for HR, since it's very difficult, if not even impossible, to upkeep the matrix teams manually, especially if you have a high dynamic organization with a lot of team changes and so on. But one way to handle this in a scalable way is, instead of asking HR for these updates, is to assign managers the access rights to actually create their own teams by adding their own team members. And this becomes especially powerful when you have agile teams that change frequently, as I mentioned before. And you can then give the managers the ownership to manage their teams that should receive the feedback surveys. And the second challenge we hear about is when the engagement platform itself, and not the HRS, that it lacks the flexibility to support the matrix structure. And usually this is because you are tied to one hierarchy, for example, or the reporting logic is simply not built with complex matrix structures in mind. So unfortunately, there's no quick fix for this specific challenge, as the solution is to use platforms that actually allow for what's called advanced segmentation. But this means that you can have multiple different reporting lines running separately from one another, which in turn will help you to create an organization structure that, accurately represents your business. So when we have an accurate company structure in place that is also up to date, we can then start tackling the second most common challenge, which is a lack of ownership over the engagement survey results. But to understand this problem, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of the, for example, functional managers, because they might not meet with their employees on as regular basis as the non-functional ones. And this in turn can make them believe that the results should be worked on by the other manager. And then from the non-functional manager's perspective, they often see engagement and development topics as something that maybe falls out of their formal responsibilities, especially if they don't handle performance reviews or compensation and so on. So what often happens is that both managers assume the other one will take action, and as a result, no one really owns the follow-up. And yeah, these set of responsibilities often differ from company to company. But if we take a look at a common scenario that we've painted here to the left, we see that the functional manager here handles competence, training, career development, performance reviews, and so on. And the non-functional manager instead handles task direction, team coordination, also some performance feedback, but on individual projects and so on. So a guideline we've seen as a best practice is to clearly communicate the responsibilities for each type of manager and then divide them accordingly. Just to give you an example of what this could look like, if we have the functional managers, here they should focus on the long-term areas like learning and development, strategy, health, and so on. While the non-functional manager instead takes ownership of the day-to-day drivers in the survey. So we'll be looking at goals, feedback, team relationships, and so forth. So by defining this upfront, you can create shared ownership without an overlap of the different areas, but instead have natural areas of responsibility for each manager depending on their role. But if we instead take a look at another scenario where the functional manager is actually expected to follow up and own all the topics in the engagement survey, how do we then ensure a well-designed process to develop both leaders? Well, if we start by mapping the non-functional manager's areas of responsibility, we might find that it makes more sense to give them a more targeted report of the core competencies required for them to actually perform their job. So another approach to this challenge could therefore be to combine the survey approaches and utilizing what's called a 360 feedback tool for the non-functional managers themselves. And the payoff here is that both leaders get the insights they need to actually grow. And the functional manager can then focus on driving engagement development across their team, while the non-functional manager gets actionable feedback on how they lead and collaborate in their day-to-day operations. So this is another approach you could take to strengthen accountability and ensure that both leaders have the tools they need to succeed. But if we take a look at the final challenge we hear about, which is not knowing which manager I'm giving feedback to, the obvious solution here, you think, might be to name the manager in each question, which in some cases makes sense. But I wanted to give you some ideas on alternative solution that doesn't cause the employees to answer the same question multiple times in a survey for each different manager. Because by using the communication recommendations I mentioned before for the different areas of responsibility, we can then target the questions to the matrix employees to define, for example, that questions in feedback and communication refer to the project manager or the non-functional manager, while learning and development to the functional manager and so on. So by using this specific functionality, we can ensure that the survey is well designed and tailored to the matrix employee. And if the areas of responsibilities are very divided between the managers, you can actually also customize the dashboard for each manager to ensure that only insights that are relevant to their role are shown. And that is if that fits your situation. But in many cases, it actually makes more sense to showcase the full picture for both manager roles, since the topics in the survey tend to correlate, and it tends to provide a deeper understanding. So you can then use other tools to communicate and set the expectations on what the manager should follow up on. But if we instead use the other approach I mentioned of combining the engagement and the 360 feedback survey, this problem statement here actually becomes obsolete, since it'll be very clear for me as an employee who I'm giving feedback to. So if this is a known challenge in the organization, the 360 feedback surveys might be worth considering for you. But that is a quick rundown of the most common challenges we've seen here. And I'd love to hear some of your questions here to see how what you're experiencing at the moment and what are experiences in that. So let's see, we have a question from Johanna. How can HR support leaders to succeed in a matrix organization? Well, as I mentioned before, it's really about setting clear expectations on the manager so it becomes quite foolproof on what they're expected to act on and own in the survey. And each matrix organization that I've spoken with has a few different processes in place or different dynamics. So it really comes down to understanding your organization and what you want to achieve out of the survey to clearly communicate this to the managers themselves. And the communication can happen in many different ways. You can have certain playbooks, or you can also use your engagement platform to have mini trainings or advice in each question section to help them understand what to do next. Perfect. Any other questions from you guys? So no, I said I would pace myself, but I paced myself a bit too quickly here since we have a lot of time left. But if there aren't any more questions, I wanted to wrap this session up and give you a couple of key takeaways. Because as I mentioned, the topic is complex and each matrix organization has its unique characteristics that you need to account for. And by understanding the dynamics, it will help you to understand the needs, which in turn then helps you also define the feedback strategy that is best fitted for your organization. As for the second takeaway, communication is really important to eliminate the gaps I mentioned in the follow-up of the results. Yeah, make sure to communicate expectations clearly for each type of manager role. And to support your communication efforts, it really helps to design the servlet method accordingly and make it really natural for the managers to own the results and also know how to follow up in the process. So thank you very much for participating in this session, and I hope you learned something that you can utilize in your matrix organization. But I hope you have a great Wednesday, sorry, and enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you. Bye-bye.